Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to our Wednesday Lighthouse Kids Club. We are doing lesson 40 today. We're going to talk about Gideon today. Remember last week we talked about Deborah, who was a judge in the land of Israel. Remember the person that God called to lead the nation of Israel to defeat their enemies was called a judge. After the people of Israel lived in the land of Canaan for a while, they started to be friendly with the people that lived there, and they started to worship those false gods that the people worshiped. Those people didn't know God, and they disobeyed God, turned away from Him, and started to worship those false gods of the people that were there. Because of their disobedience, God allowed their enemies to overtake them and made their life miserable. The enemy would sometimes take some of the Israelites prisoner, or they would require the nation of Israel to pay a lot of money to them, taxes, to keep them safe. They might have made some of the people their slaves. In our lesson last week, the enemy oppressed Israel for 20 years, long time. And finally, the people of Israel called out to God, and He sent Deborah to lead them to defeat the enemy. After Deborah led the people to defeat the king of Canaan in last week's story, the people of Israel started to disobey God again. Amazing. It would seem like they would realize that God had protected them and that they would serve Him forever. But after a while, they started to turn away from God again for 40 years. They were free from their enemies. Things were going fine. And then the country of Midian came with their army, and with an army from the Amalekites, and another country the Bible calls the children of the east. 3 armies came to fight against Israel. They stole crops right out of the field. They stole animals right out of their flocks. There were so many of them, they couldn't even count them. It was a huge army. The people of Israel cried out to God. God sent a prophet to them who preached to the people and told them, all the problems you're having, they're your own fault. You have disobeyed God. He reminded them that God had brought them out of the land of Egypt and had given them the land where they lived, and yet they turned away from Him. Then God sent an angel of the Lord to call Gideon to go out against this huge army. The angel assured Gideon, you're going to win because God has called you and God has sent you to go fight against this enemy, and He's going to fight for you. Gideon was called by God. Gideon knew how big that army was, and he was afraid. I think any one of us would have been afraid, don't you? He was afraid. That was a huge army. And he didn't think he could win that battle, even though God sent him. Gideon asked the angel, can you give me a sign of some sort to show me that God is really in this battle? So the angel asked Gideon, make some cakes of bread and some meat and put it out here on the rock. And Gideon did that, brought it to him, set it on a rock. The angel stretched out his staff to the rock, touched the meat and the cakes, and all of a sudden fire came right out of the rock and burned up the meat and the cakes. And then the angel disappeared. All of a sudden. Well, he had asked for a sign, and this clearly was a sign, but Gideon was still afraid. He asked God, can you give me another sign to show me that you're going to use me to save Israel? So Gideon said to God, I'm going to put a fleece out on the ground. Now, a fleece is a piece of animal's skin with the fur still on it. So it's leather with the fur all over it still. It was used for a blanket. It may have been a blanket that Gideon carried around and used for himself. And he asked God, make the fleece wet with the dew in the morning, but make the ground dry all around it. That's not normal. If the dew is going to be on anything, it's going to be on everything. But he said, make the fleece wet, make the ground dry. Well, the next morning, the fleece was so wet that Gideon squeezed it out. He wrung out a whole bowl full of water. It was an amazing thing, and the ground was dry. Well, surely by now Gideon would know that God had called him. He put that fleece out there, and God made it wet, and the ground was dry. Oh, Gideon was still afraid. One more sign. Lord, can you give me one more sign? Gideon said, I'm going to put the fleece out on the ground again. Going to put the fleece out there again. This time, can you make the fleece dry while the ground is all wet all around? It's also very strange because the fact is, like I said, if the dew makes things wet, makes everything wet. And in the morning, Gideon picked up that fleece and he squeezed it out, and it was just as dry as it could be, but the ground was wet all around it. It was just like Gideon asked. Surely Gideon would believe God now. After God sent him 3 signs like that. So Gideon gathered an army from the nation of Israel. There were 32,000 soldiers in the army. That sounds like a lot of men, doesn't it? 32,000 in the army. The problem was that the enemy had so many men in their army, it looked like the hill was covered with grasshoppers. There were at least 135,000 men in that army. With 32,000 in Israel, while the enemy had 135,000 men, it seemed rather hopeless. But you know what? God said, Gideon, the army's too big. Too big? How can this army be too big? They have so many. We don't have nearly as many men as they do. God said, you have disobeyed me for so long. I want you to know that I'm in control here. I want you to know that when you win this battle, it's not going to be you. I want you to know that I fought the battle for you, God told them. If you have too many soldiers in your army, then you're going to think you did it. If you have enough soldiers that there could be any way you could possibly conceive of that you could win, you're going to think you did it. You have to know that I did it. You have to know that you ought to fear me. You have to know that you ought to obey me. I want you to know for sure that I fought this battle. So God told Gideon, tell you what, Gideon, tell everybody to just go home if they're afraid. Well, he did. He told them, if you're afraid, go home. See these men leaving? And they did. A whole bunch of men left. And the people of Israel, they didn't have 32,000 men anymore. Now they only had 10,000. Well, this is even worse. Oh my goodness. The army is so much smaller than the enemy. How could they possibly win this battle? God said, the army's still too big, Gideon. The army's too big? Did you see the enemy? The army is too big? God told them, go down to the brook and tell the men to get a drink. Some of the men picked up some water in their hand and took a drink out of their hand. And other men kneeled way down and put their face right into the water. Gideon, I want you to take the men that picked up the water in their hand. They're the ones that are going to make up your army. The rest of them, go home. Now, Gideon didn't have 32,000 men. He didn't even have 10,000 men. Now, Gideon only had 300 men against this army with all these men. Oh my. God knew that Gideon was still afraid, and he wanted to show Gideon one more sign to show him you just don't need to fear. You don't need to be afraid. That night, God told Gideon to sneak into the enemy camp, and he's going to be able to hear them talk to each other. And Gideon went to listen. He and his servant sneaked into the enemy camp, and they were very, very quiet and listened. He heard two of the soldiers in the enemy talking. One of the men said, I had a dream last night. A little cake of barley bread rolled into the camp of Midian and knocked over the tent and laid it all the way down flat. And the other man looked at him and said, it's Gideon. It's Gideon. The God of Israel is going to fight for Gideon and the army of Israel. Well, when Gideon heard that, he was sure that God would fight for them. He was sure that God gave him that to hear, and that he would fight for the battle for the people of Israel, even though they had such a small army. Gideon divided his men into 3 groups. There were 100 men in each group. He gave each man a trumpet, and then he gave each man a pitcher, and he gave each man a torch. A torch is a thing that you can hold with, like on a stick, and then you light it so there's fire so you can see. And they put their torch down inside the pitcher so that the enemy couldn't see their light. And the enemy was in the valley with a hill all the way around it. Big valley, lots of space, very large. Gideon stretched his army all the way around that big hill, all the way around the enemy. And they had their torches inside their pitchers, and they had their trumpets in their other hand. And they all stood and waited, and everybody was totally quiet. Everybody was very quiet. They were waiting for a signal from Gideon. Nobody dared to move. And all of a sudden, they heard Gideon from across the hill. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon! Gideon yelled out. All 300 men cried out, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon! And they broke their pitchers, and all 300 torches were shining, and all 300 men blew with their trumpets. Well, the enemy was sound asleep. It was the middle of the night. It was very, very dark. Coming out of a deep sleep, and you know what it's like when you wake up, when you were in a sound sleep and you wake up abruptly if something scares you or something. And they heard all the yelling, they heard all the trumpets, they saw all the torches. They thought there were 300 men with torches. They thought there were 300 men with trumpets, and they thought there was an army behind every one of those men. Those 300 men the enemy army was surprised. They were shocked. They were confused, and they didn't know what was going on. They weren't quite awake yet. They didn't know where to go. And they started fighting each other. Those 135 men they didn't know where to go, and they ran this way, they ran that way with their swords and killing people as they went, and they all fought each other, and they killed each other. The whole army just killed each other. God fought for the people of Israel. They didn't have to be afraid. God showed Gideon 4 signs to make him feel better about going to the battle, but he didn't even need to do anything. Who would be crazy enough to go into battle without weapons? Who would be crazy enough to go into battle with just a pitcher and a torch and a trumpet? Only a man that was following God's instructions. Remember when the people of Israel went to Jericho? God told them, walk around the city, blow your trumpets, yell. The walls came tumbling down flat. They didn't make that wall fall down. God did. Remember in last week's lesson, Deborah went out and the Lord sent hail, the Lord sent a flood, washed the enemy away. God did that. God will fight for his people fight for his people when they trust him and obey him. God doesn't need weapons. God doesn't need a large army either to do the work that he wants to do. Those men stood and watched as that great army of men killed each other in all their confusion. So what do we learn from this story? We learn this: God is in control. Do what God says. Trust him. Obey him. I don't have to understand what he's doing, but if I trust him and obey him, I can watch him do a mighty work that's bigger than I am. Gideon didn't defeat that enemy. God did. Gideon didn't devise that battle plan. He wouldn't have devised a battle plan like that. God did. Gideon was afraid. He was afraid to go. God tried to comfort him and assure him that there was nothing to fear because God would make sure that Israel could win in that battle. And even though Gideon was afraid, God still used him to do this work because even though Gideon was afraid, he still went. And he did what God told him to do. Always obey God. Read his word. Do what he says, even if it doesn't make sense. But when you read the Bible, he tells you what you need to know. And when he gives commands, instructions, just do what he tells you to do. And that's all you need to know. You obey God. You got to come back next time and see what happens next.